O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but Thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
Welcome back, everyone. This is David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos, and today I want to speak to you guys about being proud of your neoteny. And so I know for some of you, you're going to be a bit unfamiliar with the term neoteny, and it's just a good biological term that refers to the retention of juvenile characteristics into adulthood. And so this term's used in regards to various animal species, developmental processes, as well as the domestication of animals. And what kind of spawned the idea in myself to even create a video like this had to do with me scrolling through Twitter, even interacting with a few individuals going back and forth. But what I perceive to be is young men specifically being proud of or even celebrating neotenous characteristics or behavioral patterns. And so what I want to do in this video is introduce you guys to the term neoteny. I think it's a great biological term that should be put in your linguistic repertoire or tool belt. And so introduce you to the term, how it relates to the animal kingdom, how it relates to the domestication of animals, how it even relates to evolutionary theories about hominids. I'm not endorsing these theories, but I'm just going to share them with you in terms of the academy and stuff like that. How this relates then, in my perception, to young men being proud of or retaining these sort of juvenile characteristics, and then how that relates to a sort of theological interpretation of us becoming the fullest potential or realizing or actualizing the fullest potential within us to be the men or women God created us to be. And how does that relate to neoteny? How does that relate to the domestication of animals? And how might that relate to the sort of oligarch or societal controls that are being used in the contemporary period? So that's what we're going to get into. This shouldn't be too long of a video. I don't plan on rambling for 30, 40, 50 minutes, but just trying to highlight and get this idea out to you guys. It was something I was kind of playing around with and would love to get some feedback in the comment section. So to begin with, what is neoteny? Well, like I mentioned, neoteny is the delaying or slowing of the physiological or somatic development of an organism. Or another way to put that is the retention of juvenile characteristics into adulthood. And so this process, neoteny, Neoteny, can also be referred to as progenesis, or in terms of the domestication of animals, can also be referred to as pedomorphism. And so you might be seeing where I might go here at the end of the video in regards to pedomorphism. So, in regards to theories about humanity, evolutionary theory, it's common within, if you take a biology course or something on evolutionary theory, that they'll talk about hominids, Homo sapiens, being neotenous developments from chimps, and how we display forms of neoteny because we're hairless, because we have shorter arms, maybe we don't have as dense muscle as, say, a chimpanzee or something. We have flatter faces. We have bigger heads. These would be identified as neotenous characteristics. And if you think of a baby, for example, it would have a ginormous head with unproportional arms and legs. So this unproportionality or something would be a form of neotenous characteristics, and the idea is that if we evolved from chimps, if we evolved from them, that would be the more mature form, and then us and what we developed would be a sort of neotenous form. Okay, now I'm not saying I agree with this, but that's the way it's been used. And so there's a book by an interesting scholar named Louis Bolk from 1977. It's titled Ontogeny and Phylogeny, in which he again is arguing the sort of neotenous development of humanity. However, he also gets into then carrying this even further in sort of the differentiation within races in Homo sapiens, so that can get pretty controversial real quick. And so famous scholar Stephen Jay Gould, he was an American scholar, said, well, neoteny is true in regards to human development from chimps, but it's racist and it's wrong and it's incorrect to use in regards to the various races or various phenotypes displayed within Homo sapiens themselves. So that's where the term is used and how it's understood in sort of the field of biology. In regards to the domestication of animals, again, as I said, can also be referred to as pedomorphism, is that you can deliberately select for neotenous characteristics. And so it's been known that when you provide more and more resources, that the animal species that is dependent upon those resources becomes less and less aggressive. They become less and less competitive. And that competitive urge, the competition itself, iron sharpens iron, actually promulgates and perpetuates certain physiological characteristics. And so other things that have been identified with domestication of animals, domesticated animal species, is they tend to become less sexually dimorphic. So male and female become more and more similar, not more and more different, as would be the case with more competition, more aggressiveness, or dominant displays of behavior, something like that. And they tend to become smaller in size, which would obviously make sense. And so what I want to do is begin to kind of highlight this idea in regards to humanity. Are we a form of domesticated product that's being farmed, if you will, on the planet, through culture? Because the idea is that when you domesticate an animal species, and take, for example, like a pig, some of you guys are going to be familiar with the sort of pink, relatively hairless pigs you see on a farm. And yet, if you just let them go wild, relatively quickly, they're going to start displaying more, their maturation process is going to occur, and they're going to get thicker skin, they're going to turn black, their skin color is going to change, some of them will grow horns, stuff like this. So a wild hog is very, very similar to a domesticated pig, and that it just takes the alteration in the environmental conditions to then change the physiological characteristics of that animal species. So the whole idea of nature versus nurture, right? This really highlights how much environment can really impact one's biology, one's physiology. So when that happens, it actually affects animals at the sort of genetic level, because now only certain parts of the genome are being expressed, they're being selected for, and it's all being contained based on the sort of environmental conditions. Now, what I want to connect this to is obviously humanity and potentially things that are going on right now. But what I saw on Twitter, and hopefully I have a photo up right here, is I commented on a gentleman's dinner, right? And I believe he was a groiper or something like that. And I don't mean to characterize all groipers or Fuentes' fans of any sort of broad brush. So that's not what I'm trying to do. Just this individual. And you'll see this thing, I think commonly amongst, the sort of 18 to 25-year-old men on Twitter, on social media. But he was talking about how he was a king, this is a common euphemism. And then he was talking about his dinner, which if you look at it has microwavable chicken nuggets, mac and cheese, brownies that you would get for a child with the sort of colorful sprinkles on it, and a big glass of chocolate milk. And I think it's relatively easy to see then maybe where I'm going in regards to a sort of neotenous diet, right? And how this is almost celebrated. And this is common amongst, young men on the internet, these sort of juvenile forms of diet. High sugar intake, I think, is a sort of neotenous characteristic in men and adults generally. And this sort of appetite for high amounts of sugar. And we all know what the detrimental effect sugar has on one's body, on one's physiology, on one's testosterone levels, all these things. And so I commented on this thing on Twitter about how you want to eat more meat, and you want to eat real meat, and this diet is just full of sugar. And then it got out of control, it started going back and forth, and people started saying things. But I think this idea, this neotenous characteristic, this celebration of neoteny, I think is true generally, not for everybody, but I think maybe we all display it at one level or another. And so I wanted to highlight the diet then, and I think this also connects to sort of life skills, maybe in regards to cooking, right? Because I'm not trying to lambaste this particular individual. In fact, I don't even know who he is, but just taking his meal as an example, how much cooking does that take? How much actual skill of preparation of food consumption, more a thought out understanding of one's diet, what they're trying to do with their diet, and sort of replenish one's the things that they need in terms of vitamins, minerals, proteins, all this stuff. And I wanted to connect this then, moving on to my next point, to what happens with the domestication of animal species. I mentioned that they become less sexually dimorphic, and they become smaller in size, and they become less aggressive. And I want to connect this then to weak bodies, because what I was then highlighting for a lot of these individuals is how slender their frames are, how they really don't display any sort of actual masculine characteristics. And I don't mean to be painting a broad brush on, being a masculine man. Everybody has to be a sort of Mike O'Hearn bodybuilder or something like that. That's not what I'm saying. Everybody's masculinity is a little bit different, and that's totally fine. That's not what I'm trying to say. But that there is an obvious connection with this sort of growth in men displaying very slender figures, like teenage boys and teenage girls basically have the same body frame. And then it's puberty that widens the hips of girls, widens the shoulders of boys, supposed to put on more muscle mass, all this type of stuff. But a lot of young men actually don't have what I would perceive to be any sort of masculine physical characteristics, no masculine physiology that they could alter just by changing their diet, eating more meat, potentially going to the gym, working out, doing stuff like this. And again, the phenotypes, the things that are going to be expressed from their genetics are going to change because the environmental conditions are changing. So I wanted to connect this to also, and I don't mean, again, paint a broad brush, meaning that anybody who's interested in these things must be a child, must be displaying neotenous characteristics, but I think that it's apropos how it relates to anime, how it relates to cartoons, and I know as an artistic platform, animation is actually really beneficial because you can get around a lot of the copyrights and all this stuff. You have a lot more creative freedom using animation. So I don't mean to be derogatory towards animation itself, but just how I'm seeing, this is my own perception, and maybe you guys would agree with me, and if you disagree, leave comments in the comment section, how individuals who tend to be really embedded within the sort of anime world, cartoon, animation stuff, tend to also be really interested in gaming, tend to have very slender or just, kind of out of shape bodies. They have poor diets. They don't display real masculine characteristics. And I think these things are connected. That doesn't mean that you can't, if you play video games, you're bad, or if you're interested in anime, that's not what I'm saying. But generally speaking, I think others might perceive these same connections that I'm seeing. And so when we look at the weaker body frames, and I have a thing up here that I found also on Twitter, is I believe it was a kind of a sub-comment section from Reddit of social justice warriors talking about how, the problems with men building upper body strength and how that correlates strongly to them having more conservative worldviews, more traditional worldviews, and that I believe it was was commenting to somebody that, no, it's not a good idea that leftists or social justice warriors learn how to fight or become more masculine because then that's going to change their values. And then it contributes to the idea of traditional standards for beauty, traditional standards for sexuality and gender, and that this then defeats the whole thing that they're fighting for, which is equality, equity, which then everybody's equal no matter what. And I think this really highlights then what I'm getting at in sort of the the lack of maturation. Because if you look at social justice warriors, if you look at then the sort of economic policies that they might advocate for, I think there is another correlation here in regards to the inability to take responsibility for oneself. And so, which is going to be tied with the more traditional worldview, is going to be tied in our understanding of Christianity with a sort of understanding of one's own behavior, sin, repentance, this type of thing. Again, taking on responsibility, self-accounting, where maybe socialistic more behaviors, this Antifa, you just look at Antifa, just look at the men who make up that group and look at their body frames, look at their levels of testosterone, look at the masculinity that they have on display. And most of them are going to be a sort of gamma male, a sort of beta male. And so this comment here that I have, highlights this, that even the people who are in opposition to this stuff are aware that masculinity, putting on muscle, building up testosterone is for them it's a bad thing. But I think that equates then to their economic policies of wanting to be taken care of by the government, right? This inability to take responsibility for oneself is tied to their physiology, it's tied to their diet, it's tied to their behavioral patterns. And so this also, for me, connects with the lack of certain life skills. As I mentioned, it also connects with the lack of purpose, a lack of skill, a lack of career, a lack of a talent. Not that these individuals don't have them. I'm not saying that. I'm saying if your talent is woodwork, if your talent is writing, if your talent is this or that, by playing video games at maybe a larger time frame than you should, not eating the correct diet, taking in high amounts of sugar, these are going to be detrimental to you fulfilling your purpose, your teleology, right? And as us as Christians believe everybody has a purpose, and you're really not going to be fully happy unless you're on that purpose doing the thing you're supposed to do. Because that is sort of the mechanism in which we realize, what is our gift? What is our purpose? There's a feedback loop here in terms of what satisfies us when we do it. And I think when that need isn't fulfilled, then we try to fulfill that need through other things, through sugar, through bad diets, through, the consumption of culture, really. And so I think this connects then to the lack of purpose, skill, and career or talent that some people have. Because if you have figured out what you want to do and you start doing that, that is a form of masculinity. That is a sort of taking responsibility for one's life, for one's time management, and stuff like that. Now, these aren't necessarily Christian values, but connected to what I'm saying here in regards to a sort of neotenized characteristics of young men is a lack of legacy, right? If you're watching video games, if you're watching sports can be another form of neotenization, even though when you look at the athletes themselves, they would display the opposite characteristic, right? LeBron James was not neotenized when he was 16 or 18. In fact, he was overdeveloped. He was more developed at that age. So sports themselves select for the opposite physiological characteristics in terms of having more matured body frames and stuff like that. But the people who maybe just consume it continually, they can certainly perpetuate neotenous characteristics. And so a lack of legacy, I think it's important, and I said these aren't necessarily Christian because these can be taken in the wrong direction in terms of a sort of too much emphasis on worldly pleasure, worldly acknowledgement, stuff like that. But I think it's certainly masculine. It certainly would not be a neotenous characteristic to want to have a legacy, to figure out what it is your purpose is, what is your skill, what is your career, and work at that every day, just a little bit, get better and better and better. And eventually what that does over time, again, the consistency is a big thing because we are kind of our consistent patterns. That is what makes us up. At any given time when somebody meets you for the first time, you are the sort of fruition of your continuous habitual patterns. You know what I'm saying? And so the lack of legacy, I think this is a sort of, or not wanting that, or not wanting to devote yourself to something that will outlast your own physical existence. I think that's a neotenous characteristic. I think not having a sense of pride or honor for one's family name. Now, maybe you have, a negative family situation, so that's one thing. But I think it's a typical masculine characteristic to want to represent the family, even the tribe. I think this is why paganism and sort of racial understandings are on the rise, because it's natural to try to have something that you belong to be proud of, and then to move forward in life. So sort of honoring of one's family name, this is going to be tied to not being a sort of neotenous characteristic where you're in your mother's basement playing video games, watching anime, masturbating to pornography, and again, not really doing anything in life that would be typical or traditional into what a man should do. And so this is also going to be tied to a wife and family. I think it's a neotenous characteristic to be in a sort of adolescent, perpetual state of, sex with individuals, meaningless sex and stuff like that. So a wife and a family, again, this is going to be tied to sort of legacy, tied to purpose, tied to teleology, tied to family name, all these things that I think are good. And of course, that's going to be tied to competition, because then it's about providing and getting out there in the world and doing things and being, again, the man that your family needs you to be. So I know these are very generalistic characteristics, so I don't mean to be demeaning anybody else's form of masculinity, however that be. But I think what I'm saying here, many of you will understand and agree with and acknowledge. So how does this then relate? Well, I think first, for those conspiracy-minded, I think there's an interesting connection here with the domestication of animals being called pedomorphism and the sort of selection for juvenile characteristics and neotenous characteristics, and what we believe to be essentially, an inverted fallen world run by pedophiles. Not everybody's a pedophile, but they certainly have some type of sexual perversion or proclivity that we would, understand as sinful. But just theoretically, just throwing it out there, if the world is run by pedophiles, if they understand how neotenous characteristics are developed, how the domestication of animals work, and they have the abilities and the levers and controls to alter the societal conditions, the environmental conditions, to then begin to select for neotenous characteristics, I think there's something there, right, in terms of a pedomorphism of our species itself, which then we see with the transgenderism, right? We see with the sort of emasculated men that look like teenage girls. They have the same body frame, basically. And then this sort of in-between, this non-binary status, this, just the rise in transgenderism. And I don't want to speak too much on that. I don't want my channel to be struck or this video to be taken down. So I think there's something there, right? And I just wanted to briefly connect that, right? Pedomorphism potentially with pedophile elites, the people who run the planet. What are they selecting for? And the things that they would be selecting for would not be, right, just like the domestication of animals, would not be the most masculine, aggressive, competitive physiology, genetics, mind frame, the psychology of the human race. They would be wanting to do the opposite by providing more and more resources, as you would do in the process of domestication, which we see with, capitalism and all this stuff. So I know this doesn't relate too much because you could easily see a difference. Well, Patrick, look at socialism and them running out of resources. That would seem to then insinuate a sort of rise in then aggressive competitive tendencies. I would agree. I would say that the promise, though, of the sort of social utopia where everybody's kind of given the basic necessities is underpinned with a sort of presupposition of neoteny, of demasculinizing, taking away, making our species less aggressive, less competitive. And we see this even in sports, how they're making things more feminized. They're feminizing male sports. And so I think all this stuff is connected. And how does this relate then to God? Well, if God is in control of nature, then God really wants men and women to become the fullest expressions of their sexuality and their gender, and that would certainly mean not becoming or not being satiated or stuck in a sort of neotenous state. That moving beyond one's juvenile characteristics is really essential in becoming the man that God would want you to be, because God wants us to procreate. God wants you to find a wife. God wants you to find out what your purpose is and work on that and do that, because in labor we find freedom. And I think this is a really important thing. And then even using Christ, using Jesus Christ, again, the Logos as the source of archetypes themselves, but Christ then as an archetype is the ultimate taking on of responsibility of the world, right? Of the world's sins. Now, of course, I'm not advocating for anybody to do that, but this sort of taking on one's own responsibility, finding responsibility, looking for responsibility. This is extremely tied to the maturation process, especially for men, because that's what the role is. Eventually, you take on the responsibility of the family. You're the head of the family. And so responsibility, I think, is essential into men becoming what they should be. And we should be on the lookout when society is trying to take away responsibility, and not put you in a place where you need to be responsible for your behaviors, for other people, and this type of thing. And usually that gets left to the government. And so then you can easily see how that would move into socialism, which moves into communism, which moves into atheism, which is the default governmental pattern, I believe, of the fallen world of, you want to call it Satan, the devil, evil, all that type of stuff. That's why it's default atheistic, and the state becomes a thing that is worshipped. And so the other thing related to all that, which I've already mentioned, is really following God's will for your life, because that's what Christ does through his ministry, through his life, through the crucifixion and the resurrection. It's a following of God's will for your life and figuring out what that will is, which is going to be very different for every individual, but something we should all be looking for and wanting to find that, and then take responsibility for that, and then continuing to work on that in a sort of, it may be something totally unrelated to God or anything like that, but by you actualizing whatever that potential is, whatever that skill set is, and then doing that at an incredibly high level, you are a sort of symbolic representation of God's love and God's will on earth, because of the incredible abilities that you have in doing whatever you want to do. So that kind of sums up this video, right? Is becoming more conscientious of the things we eat. For me, I eat a lot of meat. I'm a big advocate. I know Jay Dyer, who I'm a fan of. He is on the carnivore diet. Tristan, they're on the carnivore diet. I'm not on the carnivore diet per se, but I eat quite a bit of red meat, and I'm very conscientious about lifting weights, maintaining higher testosterone levels, taking responsibility for my life, figuring out, for me, academia, kind of study, making these YouTube videos. This is what I'm trying to do, and that's why I try to stay so consistent at it, try to make sure I work on it, try to get better. Every video I want to be a little bit more articulate, a little bit better in me conveying the ideas and messages I want to convey. And I still, myself, I may display neotenous characteristics, but I'm continually trying to become aware of those characteristics, aware of those behavior patterns, and then work on them. And so I think a good place to start is your diet. A good place to start is your fitness. And then from there, looking for your purpose, finding your purpose, working on that, taking responsibility for your life, taking responsibility eventually for others and a family and a wife and kids. So that kind of concludes the video, and just, leaving with the idea of pedomorphism being the sort of domestication of animals and the selecting for neotenous juvenile characteristics. Is this happening to us? Is this why masculinity is being attacked? Is because really what's happening is a slow selection for juvenile neotenous characteristics in men, making our species less and less sexually dimorphic, which is always tied to the domestication of animal species. So are we on a farm? Are we being farmed? I'll let you guys answer that question. But thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for checking out the video. Please let me know what you think in the comment section. As always, please like, share, and subscribe to the video. If you know anybody who'd be interested in this kind of content, please share the video. That's the best way to get more people in the know and over here joining our conversations and our comments and just sharing ideas and letting things see where they go. So thank you guys. Again, please like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, which should be Wednesday, as always, God bless.